Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Counterfactual Gaming, the gaming channel where if there's something historical, we don't do it. And today I want to talk about heavy fighters. And you may be wondering why I want to talk about heavy fighters while we're watching the Italian Air Force get its clocks cleaned by the British over southern England. Well, in part because I'm running heavy fighters with no fuel, so of course they perform poorly. But really I want to talk today about how to properly employ heavy fighters. And I want to boil it down to basically a couple of rules of thumb that you could use in your Hearts of Iron games, because there are situations where heavy fighters make sense to use, and there are situations where they don't make sense to use. But before we get started with that, I just want to remind everyone that if you like the content here on the channel, I want you to go ahead and drop a like and a sub on the video, and go ahead and leave a comment down below asking me why the Italian Air Force is so badly set up in this video. I'm not going to have a good answer for you, but I guarantee I will have an answer. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about heavy fighters versus light fighters. Wait, no, stop all that. This is not really about heavy fighters versus light fighters. I don't even know why I put that up on the screen. That's stupid. Instead, let's just chill out for a second, have ourselves a nice, refreshing beverage, and let's just talk about some basic rules of thumb for using heavy fighters, because there are situations where we might want to use them, there are situations where we don't want to use them. They are so context-specific that I can either talk about heavy fighters for 60 minutes, or I can give you some rules of thumb and have a much shorter video. So now that we have our refreshing beverage, let's talk about range for a second. I want to boil down heavy fighter usage into range categories before talking about a couple of other considerations that you need to be aware of if you wish to employ heavy fighters. There are basically what I consider to be three range bands for using heavy fighters. There's the red zone out to 800 kilometers, there's the yellow zone out to about 1150 kilometers, and then there's the green zone to 1200 kilometers or more. Now, when I'm talking about these three range zones, I'm talking about mainly air-to-air combat. I'm not talking about intercepting strategic bombers or shooting down close air support. We're focused primarily on air superiority. So we're dealing with when would it be effective to use a heavy fighter in air-to-air combat. The red zone out to 800 kilometers is an area where we should not be using heavy fighters. If the vast majority of your air-to-air combat is taking place in air regions within 800 kilometers of your airfields, you shouldn't be using heavy fighters. As we will see, heavy fighters perform very poorly against light fighters in this range zone. The yellow zone presents some situations where heavy fighters are useful, but these situations are highly context dependent on the presence and use of certain MIOs. And this green zone is generally the range zone where heavy fighters are, for the most part, better than light fighters in combat situations. I will note some caveats to that at the end of the video. Now, how are we going to do these tests? We are going to be doing tests without MIOs first, then we're going to test with certain MIOs. That's why I've chosen Italy and Britain. And all tests will be IC normalized. And what that means is we will have the same amount of production costs flying in the sky, not the same number of airplanes. So there's going to be fewer heavy fighters flying at any one time than there will be light fighters, simply because the heavy fighters are more expensive. So let's talk about the planes I'm using in these tests I'm about to show you. I've picked Italy and Britain for my tests. We will talk about why when we look at the MIOs in just a moment. But the basic design of the planes that we're using are going to look like this. We're using the no MIO heavy fighter here without a MIO before we apply a MIO later. It's a heavy machine gun heavy fighter with some turrets and radio navigation 1 installed. It's also a 2-engine. I tried a number of other configurations and none really performed quite as well as this one, at least at this technology level. We're assuming 1940 techs across the board here. For Britain, we have two different planes that I'm testing in these engagements. We have the basic Spitfire designed like this for being used at around 800 kilometers range. It's a heavy machine gun setup with a turret and drop tanks and a single engine. But we also have the long-range Spitfire, which swaps out the turret for the extra fuel tank upgrade. Now, remember that this module does add 50% range, but it cuts air defense by 2, meaning that the long-range Spitfire that we're looking at here would quite clearly lose to the basic Spitfire we're looking at here in combat where both planes have full mission efficiency. Just keep that fact in your head. This basic Spitfire will outperform the long-range Spitfire in the red zone 800-kilometer range. I did several different tests using British bases in southern England against Italian positions in northern France. I gave the Italians enough compliance so that airfields weren't getting blown up by partisans. Now, I chose northern France because of a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to actually test power projection. Normally, I want planes fighting each other over neutral territory or sea zones where pilot losses are going to be equal on each side. But on this case, I wanted to test power projection of these light airframes versus the power projection of the heavy fighters. And I also wanted to test it in what I consider to be a semi-realistic scenario in Europe. There are plenty of reasons Britain might want to project air power from southern England into northern France. And as you can see, these basic Spitfires that I've got right here, they have range to northern France, but they don't cover the whole air region. So I did some tests with heavy fighters trying to attack into southern England, where the light fighters would have the advantage at under 800 kilometers. I had engagements in northern France where the light fighters would be coming in with either the basic Spitfire or the long-range Spitfire against the heavy fighters. And then I repeated all of those tests with MIOs applied. But we're going to talk about no MIO tests first, because they're going to set up the context for when we talk about MIOs in a little bit. So I compiled the information from my tests. And as we can see in the red zone, the heavy fighters perform really bad against the light fighters. Both types of planes have full mission efficiency in the red zone, but those basic Spitfires are killing the heavy fighters with no MIOs. In the yellow zone, when the basic Spitfires are flying over northern France and don't have full coverage of the air region, the basic Spitfires lose to the heavy fighters. The heavy fighters, their longer range gives them more mission efficiency, and they are able to beat the basic Spitfires, even in terms of cost. If you look just at the aircraft numbers, it looks like a slaughter for the basic Spitfires. But in terms of actual production cost, it's a win for the heavy fighters, but not as big of a win as you might think. When we rerun the test in northern France in the yellow zone with long-range Spitfires, cost skews back to the Spitfires. They win in terms of production cost, even though the heavy fighters are still coming out ahead in terms of absolute number of aircraft lost. Although the long-range Spitfires are not doing nearly as well in the yellow zone as the basic Spitfires were doing in the red zone. Now, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that, yeah, if at ranges of less than 800 kilometers, light fighters are your friends. 100%, hands down, excellent choice of aircraft. In the yellow zone, if you're trying to use high-quality light fighters that do not have the extra fuel tanks upgrades, they are going to lose to heavy fighters. Light fighters with the extra fuel tanks module can trade effectively with the heavy fighters in the yellow zone. But remember what I said earlier about light fighters with extra fuel tanks. Those light fighters with extra fuel tanks will also perform worse against light fighters with different module setups due to the lower air defense. So in creating a light fighter to effectively function in the yellow zone, you've also created a light fighter that would perform poorly in the red zone against light fighters designed to fight in that range band. Lower air defense values are no joke. So what does it look like when we have MIOs involved? Well, MIOs change things significantly. Let's take a look at what the plane stats look like when we apply some MIOs. Now, Britain, of course, gets Supermarine, which is one of the best MIOs in the game for light fighters. It's tied with Mitsubishi. And just so that we all remember just how good Supermarine is, look at what the tooltips are telling us right here. air defense plus 35%, max speed plus 35%, and a bonus to air attack and agility. Supermarine is wonderful for light fighters. And you can look here and see that the long-range Spitfire with the MIO has significantly better stats, just like the basic Spitfire with a MIO has significantly better stats. I picked Italy because Italy has access to Fiat. And if we take a look at the tooltips here, you can see that Fiat has a number of nice bonuses for heavy fighters, including the speed upgrade, the air attack upgrade, and the absurd range upgrade. And just looking at the stats, like, it has an impressive 95 air attack, and I want you to look at that range for a second. Without a MIO, the heavy fighter's range is really lackluster, but we slap Fiat on there, and now it has a range of 1,700 kilometers without even batting an eye. When we're talking about going past 1,200 kilometers, MIOs like this are why heavy fighters have some real performance advantages when we look at theaters like the Pacific and Asia. But how do these planes stack up against the British Spitfires when the Spitfires have Supermarine? Well, it's not as good as you might think. With basic Spitfires in the yellow zone, you can see that even though the basic Spitfires lost more overall planes, the production cost lost is significantly lower than the heavy fighters lost. But when we take a look at the long-range Spitfires and we put a MIO on them and have them fight in northern France, the losses are absurdly bad for the heavy fighters. Just to be clear, the basic Spitfires are winning even though their mission efficiency is bad over northern France, but they're not winning by that much. But the long-range Spitfires with the full mission efficiency, because they've got the extra fuel tanks on them, they clean the clocks of those heavy fighters. It's a disaster. So, how does this tie into rules of thumb? Well, of course, you want to pay attention to your range bands, like I said. You've got your red zone, your yellow zone, and your green zone. But aside from that, if you're playing a country that has Supermarine or Mitsubishi, or that has production bonuses to small airframes, you probably don't even need to look at heavy fighters. Yes, I know Japan has commitments in the Pacific, but unless you're really trying to get to like 14, 15, 1,600 kilometer ranges, you probably just need to either focus on Mitsubishi, or for Japan, split the difference and like design with the range designer but produce with Mitsubishi. As for Britain, Supermarine is so good and Britain doesn't really have a good range designer. It just makes sense to take the production cost bonuses that Britain has and just make more Spitfires. Next thing, if you have range bonuses on certain medium airframes, you really should consider heavy fighters, because look at, you already saw the insane legs you can get on those heavy fighters without even adding any fuel tanks to them. 1,700 kilometer range is nothing to laugh at. And you're probably thinking, well, I don't need that much range in Europe. But even against the Soviets, once you get past Moscow and Stalingrad, that 1,700 kilometer range really matters. It's helpful. And our third rule of thumb is that if you're playing a country that doesn't have a ranged focus medium MIO, and you don't have something like Supermarine or Mitsubishi, you're probably going to want to use heavy fighters in the yellow zone, especially against the AI. You have to understand that you will be at a real disadvantage projecting air power in general. That's just what's going to happen. I can't make it any better than that. But there are some caveats to this. If you have congested airfields, you're going to want to consider some heavy fighters, because you can put the heavy fighters at airfields that are further away. Also, heavy fighters use more aluminum. If you're playing a country that hurts for aluminum, you may consider using light airframes instead. And of course, if you're playing a country that has a boost to a production type of a specific airplane, you should probably favor that airplane. And what about multiplayer? In multiplayer, the sheer number of aircraft being built necessitates some heavy fighter production. But that's something that your multiplayer group has to have rules about and decide what country is producing the heavy fighters and what countries are not producing the heavy fighters. Again, it's very country specific on MIOs and production bonuses. And that about wraps everything up. While I'm invading Belgium here, I just wanted to thank all of my members and subscribers for supporting the channel. And I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing next, but it might have something to do with infantry kits. I'll talk more about that later in a community post. Hope everyone's having a nice day, and I'll talk to you later.